Hey guys, tonight we're going back more than 200 years to follow the extraordinary life of Napoleon Bonaparte. Born on the island of Corsica, he rose from humble beginnings to become a legendary military commander and emperor of the French, reshaping Europe through years of war, conquest, and revolution. Also, let me know where you guys are tuning in from. It's always interesting to see where everyone is listening from across the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into the remarkable story of Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769, in the small coastal town of Ajaccio, on the Mediterranean island of Corsica. At the time, Corsica was a rugged and relatively poor place, covered with mountains, forests, and isolated villages overlooking the deep blue waters of the Mediterranean. It was also an island undergoing enormous political change. Only the year before Napoleon's birth, the Republic of Genoa had transferred control of Corsica to France, and French soldiers had recently defeated the Corsican resistance that had fought to preserve the island's independence. Napoleon therefore entered the world at a moment when Corsica itself was being transformed. His family belonged to the minor Corsican nobility, though they were far from wealthy. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer who worked hard to improve the family's position, while his mother, Letizia Ramolino, was remembered as a strong and disciplined woman who managed a large household through periods of uncertainty. Napoleon was one of several surviving children, and family life could be crowded, demanding, and sometimes chaotic. Years later, even after palaces and imperial ceremonies had become part of his everyday life, Napoleon would continue to remain closely connected to the brothers and sisters with whom he had grown up. As a child, Napoleon spoke Corsican and Italian before he became comfortable speaking French. He grew up hearing stories about Corsica's struggle against foreign rule, and during his earliest years, he identified strongly with the island rather than with France. The Corsican independence leader, Pasquale Paoli, became one of his early heroes. It is one of the great ironies of Napoleon's life that the boy who once admired resistance to French rule would eventually become the most powerful ruler France had seen in generations. Napoleon's childhood did not immediately suggest that he would one day dominate Europe. He was serious, stubborn, and often preferred reading or spending time alone to joining the games of other children. He developed an interest in history at an early age, particularly stories about ancient commanders and powerful civilizations. Figures such as Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great belonged to a distant world, but their stories fascinated the young Corsican boy. Military glory, political power, and the rise and fall of great states became subjects he returned to again and again. His father soon realized that service to France could provide opportunities that Corsica could not. Through his family's noble status and political connections, Carlo secured places for his sons in French schools. In 1779, when Napoleon was only 9 years old, he left Corsica for mainland France. It was the beginning of a separation that would gradually change his identity and eventually the history of Europe. After briefly studying French, Napoleon entered the military school at Brienne in northeastern France. For a boy from Corsica, the transition was difficult. His French carried a heavy accent. His family had far less money than many of his classmates, and he sometimes found himself treated as an outsider. Napoleon never completely forgot these experiences. Rather than trying desperately to fit in, he increasingly withdrew into his studies. Brienne was a disciplined world of uniforms, lessons, inspections, and military exercises. Napoleon studied mathematics, geography, history, literature, and military subjects. Mathematics became particularly important to him. His ability with numbers would later help steer him toward artillery, a branch of the military in which calculating distances, angles, and trajectories mattered enormously. He also continued reading whenever he could. Ancient history captured his imagination, as did accounts of great statesmen and generals. Napoleon was beginning to develop the extraordinary memory that would later impress those around him. He could absorb large amounts of information and recall details about geography, military units, roads, supplies, and individuals with surprising accuracy. Yet there was still nothing inevitable about his future. At this point, Napoleon was simply a young student from a relatively obscure Mediterranean island preparing for a career in the French army. France itself was still ruled by King Louis XVI, and the old social order appeared firmly established. Few people could have imagined that within a decade the monarchy would collapse, revolution would sweep across the country, and opportunities would suddenly appear for ambitious young officers who might otherwise have spent their lives in obscurity. In 1784, Napoleon was admitted to the prestigious École Militaire in Paris. The move brought him into the heart of the French kingdom. Paris was larger and grander than anything he had known before, filled with elegant buildings, crowded streets, wealthy aristocrats, merchants, soldiers, and ordinary workers. Beyond the impressive appearance of the capital, however, France was struggling with enormous debts and growing social tensions. Napoleon's time at the school was shortened by tragedy. His father died in 1785, leaving the family with financial difficulties and placing greater responsibility on the young Napoleon. Rather than completing the usual 2 years of study, he finished the program in roughly 1 year. At just 16 years old, he received his commission as a second lieutenant in the artillery. His first assignments were not particularly glamorous. Life as a junior officer involved training, studying, managing equipment, and living on a modest income. He continued to read constantly and remained deeply interested in Corsican politics. At times, his attention seemed divided between his military career in France and his hopes for the future of his native island. Then, in 1789, everything began to change. France had entered a severe financial and political crisis. Food prices were high, the government was deeply in debt, and anger toward the privileges enjoyed by the nobility and clergy had been growing for years. When representatives gathered at Versailles to address the crisis, events quickly moved beyond anything the monarchy could control. In Paris, crowds stormed the Bastille. Across the country, old institutions began to crumble. The French Revolution had begun. For a young officer like Napoleon, the revolution would bring uncertainty, danger, and extraordinary opportunity. The old world in which birth and family connections had determined so much of a person's future was beginning to disappear. Armies would soon march across Europe, generals would rise and fall with astonishing speed, and France would desperately need talented officers capable of leading its soldiers. Napoleon Bonaparte was 20 years old. His quiet years of preparation were almost over. When the French Revolution began in 1789, Napoleon Bonaparte was still a young artillery officer with an uncertain future. He had received a military education and a commission in the French army, but his ambitions remained divided between France and Corsica. The revolution would eventually force him to choose between the island of his birth and the country that had trained him as a soldier. At first, Napoleon welcomed many of the changes taking place in France. The old monarchy had been built around privilege, tradition, and social rank, while the revolution promised a society in which talent might matter more than birth. For someone from a relatively poor family of minor Corsican nobility, that idea carried obvious appeal. Napoleon was ambitious, intelligent, and professionally trained, but under the old system, there were limits to how far a young officer like him could realistically expect to rise. For several years, however, his attention remained focused on Corsica. Napoleon returned to the island repeatedly and became involved in its increasingly complicated politics. His childhood hero, Pasquale Paoli, had returned from exile after the revolution and was once again one of the most important figures on the island. Napoleon initially admired him deeply and hoped to participate in a new political future for Corsica. But the relationship between the Bonaparte family and Paoli gradually deteriorated. France itself was becoming more radical, while Paoli grew increasingly suspicious of the revolutionary government in Paris. Napoleon, meanwhile, moved closer to the French revolutionary cause. The political disagreements became personal, and by 1793, the Bonaparte family found itself in a dangerous position. Eventually, Napoleon and his family were forced to flee Corsica. They escaped to mainland France, leaving behind the island where Napoleon had spent his childhood and once imagined building his future. The departure marked an important turning point. Although Napoleon would always remain proud of his Corsican origins, His destiny was now tied firmly to France, and France was at war. By 1793, the revolution had transformed into a struggle for survival. King Louis XVI had been executed in January, and many of Europe's monarchies viewed revolutionary France with alarm. Britain, Austria, Spain, Prussia, and several other powers became involved in wars against the new French Republic. At the same time, rebellions and political violence were spreading within France itself. The country desperately needed soldiers, supplies, and competent officers. The revolution had caused many aristocratic officers to flee France, leaving vacancies throughout the army. Promotions that once might have taken decades could now happen remarkably quickly. A young officer who demonstrated ability on the battlefield might suddenly find himself commanding hundreds or even thousands of men. Napoleon was about to receive exactly such an opportunity. In the summer of 1793, rebellion broke out in the important Mediterranean port of Toulon. Opponents of the revolutionary government seized control of the city and invited British and Allied forces to enter the harbour. For the French Republic, this was a serious threat. Toulon contained a major naval base, ships, weapons, and valuable military facilities. Allowing the British to remain there was unacceptable. A revolutionary army surrounded the city and began preparations to retake it. Napoleon arrived at Toulon as a young artillery officer. He was only 24 years old and largely unknown outside military circles. Yet almost immediately, he began studying the battlefield with remarkable attention. Toulon itself was heavily defended, but Napoleon realized that simply attacking the city directly would be costly and unnecessary. The key was the harbour. British and Allied ships depended on control of the waters surrounding Toulon. Napoleon identified several positions overlooking the harbour, where French artillery could threaten the enemy fleet. If those heights could be captured and heavy guns placed there, the British ships would be forced to withdraw. Without naval support, the defenders of Toulon would find their position extremely difficult to maintain. It was a relatively simple idea, but implementing it required enormous effort. Napoleon organized batteries, gathered artillery pieces, improved defensive positions, and worked relentlessly to prepare his guns. He seemed to be everywhere at once, inspecting equipment, calculating firing positions, directing soldiers, and demanding supplies. Artillery warfare required patience and precision. Cannons had to be moved across difficult ground, ammunition had to arrive continuously, and every position had to be carefully selected. The young officer proved unusually good at it. Those who worked around Napoleon began noticing his energy. He could remain active for extraordinary periods of time, sleeping only briefly before returning to his duties. He was demanding toward others, but even more demanding toward himself. He understood that artillery was not simply about firing cannons. It was about concentrating overwhelming force at exactly the right place and exactly the right moment. During the fighting, Napoleon was wounded in the thigh by a bayonet. The injury was serious enough to remind him how easily a military career could end, but he recovered and continued directing operations. In December 1793, French forces launched a major assault against the positions controlling the harbour. The fighting was intense. Soldiers moved through darkness and confusion, while artillery thundered across the surrounding hills. Eventually, the French captured the crucial forts. Napoleon's prediction proved correct. Once French guns could dominate the harbour, the British position became increasingly dangerous. The evacuation began soon afterward. Before leaving, British forces attempted to destroy French ships and naval stores that could not be taken with them. Fires spread through parts of the arsenal as the Allied fleet prepared to sail away. On December 19th, French Republican forces entered Toulon. The victory was an important success for the revolutionary government, and Napoleon's role did not go unnoticed. Senior officers praised his ability, and reports describing his performance traveled upward through the military command. Soon afterward, Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general. He was only 24. The promotion was extraordinary, but revolutionary France was producing extraordinary careers. The old system of slow advancement had been shattered. Napoleon had arrived at Toulon as an obscure artillery officer and left as one of the youngest generals in the French army. Yet success during the revolution could be dangerous. The political situation in France remained unstable. and increasingly violent. The period later remembered as the Reign of Terror was underway. Revolutionary leaders accused one another of betrayal, and political alliances could change with frightening speed. Thousands of people were imprisoned, and many were sent to the guillotine. Napoleon had connections with Augustin Robespierre, the younger brother of Maximilien Robespierre, one of the most powerful figures in the revolutionary government. For a time, this connection helped Napoleon's career. But when Maximilien Robespierre was overthrown and executed in July 1794, anyone associated with his political circle suddenly became suspicious. Napoleon was arrested. For a young general whose career had only just begun, the situation was extremely dangerous. In revolutionary France, imprisonment could easily be followed by execution. Napoleon spent nearly 2 weeks in custody while officials investigated his political connections. Eventually, he was released. There was insufficient evidence that he had participated in any conspiracy, but his position remained uncertain. The rapid promotion that followed Toulon had suddenly stalled. For a time, Napoleon found himself without an important command, living in Paris and waiting for another opportunity. That opportunity arrived in 1795. Once again, political unrest threatened the government. Royalist supporters and other opponents of the revolutionary regime prepared an uprising in Paris. Thousands of armed insurgents moved toward key government buildings, and officials needed someone capable of organizing the city's defense. Napoleon was given a role in the operation. He understood immediately that artillery would be decisive. Cannons were positioned to defend the approaches to the government. When the insurgents advanced on October 5, 1795, the soldiers defending the revolutionary government opened fire. The confrontation was short and violent. The uprising collapsed. Napoleon's actions helped save the government, and once again his reputation rose dramatically. Political leaders who had barely noticed him before now understood that the young Corsican general could act quickly and decisively during a crisis. Within months, he received an opportunity far greater than anything he had previously commanded. The government appointed Napoleon commander of the Army of Italy. He was 26 years old. The army he inherited was poorly supplied, badly paid, and exhausted. Many of its soldiers lacked proper uniforms and equipment. Across the mountains waited experienced Austrian and Piedmontese forces who had been fighting France for years. Napoleon had never commanded an army on this scale, but in the spring of 1796, he crossed the mountains and joined his soldiers. Europe was about to learn his name. In March of 1796, Napoleon Bonaparte arrived to take command of the Army of Italy. He was only 26 years old. Many of the generals beneath him were older, more experienced, and initially skeptical of their new commander. Napoleon was relatively small, thin and youthful in appearance, and he had never before commanded an entire army in a major campaign. Yet within weeks, many of those doubts would disappear. The army Napoleon inherited was in poor condition. The soldiers were stationed along the mountainous frontier between France and northern Italy, where they had endured months of shortages. Food was limited, uniforms were worn, boots were falling apart, and pay was often delayed. Some soldiers were forced to survive by taking whatever they could find from the surrounding countryside. Morale was low, and the army had achieved little against the forces opposing it. Napoleon understood that before he could ask these men to march and fight, he needed to give them something they had been missing: confidence. He addressed his soldiers with promises of fertile plains, wealthy cities, and victory beyond the mountains. Whether every word attributed to him was spoken exactly as later remembered is uncertain, but the message was clear. Their suffering would not continue forever. If they followed him into Italy, Napoleon promised that better days were waiting. The strategic situation was difficult. France faced two main opponents in northern Italy: the Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont and the Austrian Empire. Together, their armies outnumbered Napoleon's forces in the region. But Napoleon noticed an important weakness. The Allied armies were separated geographically, and communication between them was slow. If he moved quickly enough, he could strike the space between them, defeat each opponent separately, and prevent them from combining their strength. Speed would become one of the defining features of Napoleon's campaigns. Rather than spreading his forces evenly across a broad front, he concentrated them at decisive points. His soldiers marched rapidly, sometimes covering remarkable distances in only a few days. Napoleon understood that an army did not need to be stronger everywhere. It only needed to be stronger at the place where the decisive battle occurred. In April, the campaign began. Napoleon moved against the Allied forces in a rapid series of engagements. At Montenotte, Millesimo, Dago, and Mondovi, his army struck repeatedly. The battles themselves were not enormous compared with the clashes Napoleon would later fight, but their effect was dramatic. Within roughly 2 weeks, the Sardinian government had been forced to seek peace. One enemy had effectively been removed from the war. Napoleon could now turn his full attention toward Austria. His army moved eastward across northern Italy, approaching the Po River and then the Adda. Austrian forces attempted to slow the French advance near the small town of Lodi, where a long bridge crossed the river. Cannons defended the far side, making any direct assault extremely dangerous. On May 10th, French soldiers attacked. Artillery fire thundered across the river while troops rushed toward the bridge. Smoke covered parts of the battlefield, and Austrian guns fired into the advancing columns. The fighting became chaotic, but eventually French forces crossed the bridge and pushed the Austrians from their positions. The Battle of Lodi was not the largest or most important victory of Napoleon's career, but it had a powerful effect on him personally. He later suggested that it was around this time that he began to believe he might be capable of truly extraordinary things. Until then, he had been a talented young general. Now he was beginning to imagine a much greater future. Only days later, Napoleon entered Milan. The city was one of the richest and most important in northern Italy. To Napoleon's soldiers, who had recently been hungry and poorly supplied in the mountains, the transformation must have seemed remarkable. They had crossed into prosperous territory, defeated experienced armies, and captured important cities in a matter of weeks. Napoleon's reputation began spreading beyond the battlefield. Newspapers in France reported his victories, often using dramatic language. His name appeared again and again in official dispatches. Napoleon understood the power of publicity and made certain that his successes were described in ways that captured the imagination of the French public. But the war was far from over. The Austrians still controlled the fortress of Mantua, one of the strongest defensive positions in northern Italy. Napoleon placed the city under siege, but Austria repeatedly sent armies to relieve it. Over the following months, Napoleon would face one difficult campaign after another. At Castiglione, in August 1796, he defeated an Austrian relief force. Then came another series of marches and battles as Austria attempted again to break through. Napoleon's soldiers were becoming accustomed to constant movement. They marched through heat, rain, mud, mountains, villages, and farmland. Supplies remained inconsistent. Hunger was common, and disease could sometimes kill more men than enemy fire. The romantic paintings later created of Napoleon's campaigns rarely captured these quieter realities. For the ordinary soldier, victory often meant another march, beginning the following morning. Napoleon shared some of those hardships. He traveled constantly between units, studying maps, reading reports, issuing orders, and sometimes appearing unexpectedly near the front. His ability to remember details impressed those around him. He wanted to know where his divisions were located, how many soldiers they contained, how much ammunition remained, and which roads they could use. One of the most famous moments of the campaign came in November at the Battle of Arkel. Austrian forces occupied strong positions near marshy ground and waterways. The fighting continued for several days as Napoleon attempted to force a crossing. Later paintings would show Napoleon dramatically carrying a French flag across the bridge at Arkel, personally leading his soldiers forward. The reality was more complicated, but Napoleon did expose himself to danger during the fighting, and the episode became part of the growing legend surrounding him. The French eventually forced the Austrians to withdraw. Still, Austria refused to abandon Mantua. In January 1797, another Austrian army approached. The resulting Battle of Rivoli became one of Napoleon's greatest early victories. His forces occupied high ground, while Austrian columns approached from several directions. Napoleon rapidly shifted troops across the battlefield, reinforcing threatened positions and concentrating his strength where it was needed most. The Austrians were defeated. Soon afterward, Mantua surrendered. In less than a year, Napoleon had transformed the situation in Italy. An army that had once been poorly supplied and largely ignored had defeated multiple Austrian armies and captured enormous stretches of territory. Napoleon was no longer simply one successful general among many. He had become a national celebrity, and his power was growing in ways that went beyond military command. Napoleon negotiated treaties, reorganized territories, collected money from conquered regions, and helped establish new republics influenced by revolutionary France. Paintings, manuscripts, and valuable works of art were sent from Italy back to France. The campaign was becoming both a military conquest and a political transformation. Napoleon was beginning to behave less like an ordinary general and more like an independent ruler. Back in Paris, this caused both admiration and concern. The French government, known as the Directory, had given Napoleon command of an army. Instead, he had become one of the most famous men in the country. His soldiers were loyal to him, newspapers celebrated him, and he was negotiating with foreign governments, almost as if he represented France personally. Napoleon was still only 27. During the campaign, his personal life was changing as well. Shortly before leaving for Italy, he had married Josephine de Beauharnais, a sophisticated widow several years older than him. Napoleon became deeply attached to her and wrote passionate letters during his campaigns, sometimes sending several in quick succession. His letters reveal a very different side of the commander who appeared so controlled on the battlefield. The relationship would eventually become complicated, but for the moment Napoleon thought constantly of Josephine while his armies moved across Italy. By the spring of 1797, Austrian resistance in Italy had largely collapsed. Napoleon advanced toward Austria itself, threatening Vienna. The Austrian government finally agreed to negotiate. The resulting Treaty of Campo Formio ended the campaign and confirmed many of France's gains. Napoleon returned to France in late 1797 as a hero. Crowds knew his name. Politicians watched him carefully. Soldiers admired him. Newspapers had transformed his victories into stories of almost effortless brilliance. But Napoleon understood that fame could disappear as quickly as it appeared. He needed another campaign. Directly attacking Britain, France's most persistent enemy, would be extremely difficult. The British Royal Navy controlled the seas, making an invasion dangerous. Napoleon began considering a different strategy. Rather than attacking Britain itself, perhaps France could threaten Britain's trade and its connection with India. To do that, Napoleon looked toward a land that had fascinated European conquerors for thousands of years: Egypt. In 1798, a fleet began preparing in the Mediterranean. Thousands of soldiers boarded ships. Alongside them traveled engineers, scientists, artists, mathematicians, and scholars. Napoleon Bonaparte was heading east. In the spring of 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte prepared for a campaign unlike anything he had attempted before. His victories in Italy had made him one of the most famous generals in France, but Britain remained at war with the French Republic. A direct invasion across the English Channel seemed too dangerous, while the powerful British Royal Navy controlled the seas. Instead, Napoleon proposed striking farther away, at a place connected to Britain's growing influence and trade in the East. His destination was Egypt. Egypt occupied an important position between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and from there, Napoleon hoped France might threaten British interests and perhaps eventually challenge the routes leading toward India. But Napoleon was attracted to Egypt for another reason as well. Like many educated Europeans of his generation, he had grown up fascinated by the ancient world. The land of the pharaohs, pyramids, and ruined temples seemed mysterious and almost timeless. In May 1798, a large French expedition sailed from the Mediterranean port of Toulon. Tens of thousands of soldiers traveled aboard the fleet, accompanied by horses, artillery, supplies, and equipment. But this was not purely a military expedition. Napoleon also brought more than 100 scholars, scientists, engineers, artists, and other specialists. They would study Egypt's geography, plants, animals, architecture, history, and ancient monuments. The fleet's first major target was Malta. The island was controlled by the Knights of St. John and occupied an important position in the Mediterranean. Napoleon's forces captured it quickly in June, reorganized its administration, and continued eastward. The journey itself was dangerous. British ships under Admiral Horatio Nelson were searching the Mediterranean for Napoleon's fleet. For a time, the two forces passed surprisingly close to one another without meeting. Had Nelson discovered the French transports at sea, Napoleon's Egyptian expedition might have ended before it truly began. Instead, the French reached the Egyptian coast. On July 1st, 1798, Napoleon's forces began landing near Alexandria. The operation was difficult and hurried, partly because Napoleon feared that British ships might appear at any moment. Soldiers came ashore under the hot Mediterranean sun and prepared to advance into a landscape unlike the green fields and mountains of Italy. Alexandria was captured quickly. From there, Napoleon ordered his army toward Cairo. The march was exhausting. Egypt's summer heat was severe, water could be difficult to find, and many soldiers were unprepared for the conditions. Sand worked its way into clothing and equipment. Thirst became a constant problem. Soldiers who had marched through the Alps and northern Italy now found themselves crossing dry landscapes beneath an unfamiliar sun. Their main opponents were the Mamluks, a powerful military elite that had dominated much of Egyptian political life. Mamluk cavalrymen were skilled horsemen, often beautifully equipped and individually formidable. Napoleon, however, relied on discipline and formation rather than individual skill. On July 21st, the two armies met near Cairo. In the distance stood the pyramids of Giza. Napoleon arranged his divisions into large defensive formations capable of resisting cavalry attacks. Infantry formed the outer lines while artillery and supplies were protected within. When Mamluk horsemen charged, they encountered organized volleys of musket and artillery fire. The result was devastating. The French maintained their formations, while repeated attacks failed to break them. By the end of the battle, Napoleon had won another striking victory. The confrontation became known as the Battle of the Pyramids, although the fighting took place several miles from the monuments themselves. Soon afterward, Napoleon entered Cairo. For a brief moment, the campaign seemed to be proceeding almost exactly as he had hoped. Alexandria had fallen, the Mamluk army had been defeated, and Cairo was under French control. Then news arrived from the coast. On August 1st, Admiral Nelson finally found the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay. That evening, the British attacked. The Battle of the Nile was catastrophic for France. British ships maneuvered into unexpected positions and opened fire at close range. The fighting continued into the night. At around 10 o'clock, the French flagship L'Orient caught fire. Flames spread across the vessel until its ammunition stores exploded in an enormous blast that could be heard for miles. By the time the battle ended, much of the French fleet had been destroyed or captured. Napoleon's army was now stranded in Egypt. The Mediterranean, which had carried him there, was effectively controlled by the British. Returning tens of thousands of soldiers to France would be extraordinarily difficult. Napoleon tried to present the situation confidently. He continued reorganizing Egypt and attempted to establish French administration. Taxes were collected, councils were created, and proclamations were issued. Napoleon also tried to convince Egyptians that France had come as an enemy of the Mamluks rather than an enemy of Islam. The reality was far more complicated. Many Egyptians viewed the French as foreign occupiers. Cultural differences, taxation, military control, and resentment toward the invasion created growing tension. In October 1798, an uprising erupted in Cairo. French soldiers fought through the streets to regain control, and the revolt was suppressed harshly. Meanwhile, the scholars who had traveled with Napoleon began their work. They measured monuments, recorded inscriptions, studied plants and animals, drew maps, and documented ancient sites. Their research would eventually contribute to the enormous Description de l'Égypte, one of the most ambitious scholarly studies of Egypt produced in Europe at the time. Then, in 1799, French soldiers working near the town of Rosetta discovered an unusual stone. It contained writing in three scripts: Greek, Demotic, and Egyptian hieroglyphs. The object became known as the Rosetta Stone. Years later, comparisons between the inscriptions would play a crucial role in deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphs, opening a new window into thousands of years of ancient Egyptian history. But while scholars studied the past, Napoleon had to worry about the present. The Ottoman Empire, which formerly ruled Egypt, had declared war on France. Napoleon learned that Ottoman forces were preparing to attack. Rather than wait for them to arrive, he decided to move north into Ottoman Syria. Early in 1799, French troops crossed the Sinai and advanced along the eastern Mediterranean coast. The campaign became increasingly brutal. French forces captured several towns before reaching Jaffa. After intense fighting, the city fell. Thousands of prisoners were taken, and Napoleon faced the problem of what to do with them while his army continued marching. In one of the darkest episodes of his career, large numbers of prisoners were executed on his orders. Disease was also spreading. Plague appeared among the troops, creating fear throughout the army. Soldiers who had survived musket fire and cavalry charges could suddenly become sick without warning. Military hospitals filled with exhausted and feverish men. Napoleon continued north toward Acre. The fortified coastal city became the turning point of the Syrian campaign. Napoleon expected to capture it quickly, but the defenders resisted with support from British ships offshore. French artillery equipment had been intercepted, defenses were strengthened, and repeated assaults failed. Weeks passed. Napoleon's soldiers attacked the walls again and again, but Acre refused to fall. For one of the first times in his rapidly rising career, Napoleon encountered an obstacle that determination and speed could not overcome. By May, he abandoned the siege. The French army began the difficult retreat toward Egypt. Soldiers were exhausted, supplies were limited, and the plague continued to follow the army. The march back across the desert was a grim contrast to the confident victories Napoleon had experienced in Italy. Once in Egypt, however, Napoleon soon faced another threat. An Ottoman army landed at Abukir in July 1799. Napoleon moved rapidly against it and won a major victory, restoring some of the prestige lost at Acre. But his attention was increasingly turning toward France. News from Europe arrived slowly, sometimes months late. What Napoleon learned concerned him. French armies had suffered setbacks, the government remained unpopular, and political instability was once again spreading through the country. Napoleon began to see an opportunity. In August 1799, he made a remarkable decision. Leaving much of his army behind in Egypt under the command of General Jean-Baptiste Kleber, Napoleon secretly boarded a ship and sailed for France. The journey was dangerous. British ships still patrolled the Mediterranean, and capture could have ended Napoleon's career. But after several weeks at sea, he reached the French coast safely. When Napoleon returned, the public did not greet him as the commander of a failed expedition. They greeted him as a hero. News of his victories had traveled faster than the full story of the campaign's difficulties. France remembered the conqueror of Italy and the victor at the pyramids. And France itself was exhausted. 10 years of revolution had brought political upheaval, economic problems, executions, rebellion, and almost constant warfare. The government of the Directory had become deeply unpopular. Many French citizens wanted stability. Napoleon had returned at exactly the right moment. Within weeks, politicians began meeting quietly behind closed doors. Plans were discussed for replacing the government. Napoleon's military reputation made him enormously valuable to those involved. But Napoleon was no longer interested in simply serving another government. He had commanded armies, negotiated treaties, governed conquered territories, and watched political leaders rise and fall. Now, at 30 years old, Napoleon Bonaparte was preparing to seize power for himself. When Napoleon Bonaparte returned to France in October 1799, he found a country exhausted by nearly a decade of revolution. Governments had risen and fallen, political factions had fought bitterly for control, and France had spent years at war with much of Europe. The Directory, which had governed the country since 1795, was deeply unpopular. Corruption, financial problems, and military setbacks had weakened public confidence, and many French citizens simply wanted stability. Napoleon arrived at precisely the right moment. Despite the difficulties of the Egyptian campaign, his reputation remained remarkably strong. The victories at the Pyramids and Aboukir had been celebrated in France, while the destruction of the French fleet and the failure at Acre had received far less attention. To many people, Napoleon was still the brilliant young general who had transformed the war in Italy. Behind the scenes, several influential political figures were already considering how to replace the Directory. Among them was Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, one of the directors and a veteran of revolutionary politics. Sieyès believed France needed a stronger government and began searching for a military leader who could support a change of power. Napoleon quickly became the obvious choice. The plan unfolded in November 1799 during the revolutionary month known as Brumaire. Political leaders arranged for the two legislative councils to move outside Paris to the Palace of Saint-Cloud, supposedly because of fears that a conspiracy threatened the government. Napoleon was given command of troops around the capital. On November 9th, several members of the Directory resigned or were pushed aside. The existing government began to collapse. The following day proved more difficult. Napoleon entered the chambers where the legislators were meeting, hoping his presence would persuade them to support the new government. Instead, he encountered anger and confusion. Some representatives accused him of attempting to become a dictator. Voices filled the chamber, and the situation became chaotic. For a brief moment, the coup appeared to be failing. Napoleon was far more comfortable commanding soldiers on a battlefield than confronting hostile politicians in a crowded room. His speeches were uncertain, and he struggled to control the legislators. Eventually, his brother Lucien, who held an important position in one of the councils, helped turn the situation in Napoleon's favor. Soldiers entered the chamber and dispersed the remaining representatives. The Directory was finished. A new government called the Consulate was established, officially led by 3 consuls. On paper, Napoleon shared power with 2 other men. In practice, there was little doubt about who controlled France. Napoleon became first consul. He was 30 years old. His rise had been astonishing. Only 6 years earlier, he had been a relatively unknown artillery officer at Toulon. Now he stood at the head of one of Europe's most powerful countries. But Napoleon understood that taking power was easier than keeping it. France remained at war. Its finances were troubled. Political divisions remained deep, and the government needed legitimacy. Napoleon therefore began working at a remarkable pace to reorganize the country. He surrounded himself with ministers, administrators, lawyers, military officers, and advisors. Meetings could continue late into the night. Napoleon had an enormous appetite for information and often questioned officials in great detail. He wanted reports on roads, taxes, military supplies, schools, government appointments, and countless other matters. One of his first priorities was restoring financial stability. Tax collection was reorganized, government spending was more closely controlled, and in 1800, the Bank of France was established. Napoleon wanted a government capable of reliably collecting revenue and paying its soldiers and officials. He also strengthened the administration of France. Prefects were appointed to oversee departments across the country, giving the central government greater control over local affairs. The system was efficient but highly centralized. Napoleon had little interest in allowing local political independence to interfere with decisions made in Paris. Education also received attention. New secondary schools known as lycées were created to educate future military officers, administrators, engineers, and officials. Napoleon believed advancement should depend partly on ability rather than simply family background, though society under his rule remained far from equal. Perhaps his most enduring domestic achievement was the creation of a unified legal system. Before the Revolution, French law had been a complicated mixture of regional customs, royal laws, and local traditions. Napoleon supported the work of legal experts who attempted to bring these systems together into a single clear code. The result was the Civil Code of 1804, later widely known as the Napoleonic Code. The code protected several important revolutionary principles, including equality of male citizens before the law, protection of property, and the abolition of many old feudal privileges. At the same time, it strengthened the authority of fathers and husbands within families and restricted the legal position of women. Versions of the code would influence legal systems far beyond France. Long after Napoleon's armies disappeared, elements of his legal reforms survived across Europe and other parts of the world. Napoleon also needed to resolve France's bitter conflict with the Catholic Church. The revolution had confiscated church property, closed monasteries, and created years of hostility between revolutionary governments and many religious citizens. Napoleon was personally less interested in theology than in political stability. He understood that religion remained deeply important to millions of French people. In 1801, his government reached an agreement with Pope Pius VII, known as the Concordat. Catholic worship was allowed greater freedom, while the French government maintained significant authority over the church within France. Slowly, some of the divisions left by the revolution began to settle, but Napoleon's position still depended heavily on military success. Austria remained at war with France, and in 1800, Napoleon once again crossed the Alps into northern Italy. The journey would later become the subject of one of the most famous images of his career, showing him calmly riding a rearing horse through the mountains. In reality, the crossing was considerably less glamorous. Napoleon traveled much of the difficult terrain on a mule. The purpose of the maneuver was serious. Napoleon hoped to appear unexpectedly behind Austrian forces operating in Italy. His army crossed the Great St. Bernard Pass, dragging artillery through narrow mountain routes and across snow-covered ground. In June, Napoleon confronted the Austrians near the village of Marengo. At first, the battle went badly. Austrian forces attacked strongly and pushed the French backward. For much of the day, Napoleon appeared to be facing defeat. Then French reinforcements arrived under General Louis Desaix. A counterattack began. Desaix was killed during the fighting, but the French assault transformed the battle. Austrian forces that had believed victory was near were suddenly thrown into confusion and retreat. Marengo became another celebrated Napoleonic victory. The political importance of the battle was enormous. Napoleon returned to France with his authority strengthened. The image of the victorious first consul became increasingly difficult for political opponents to challenge. By 1802, France had reached temporary peace with its major enemies. The Treaty of Amiens ended hostilities with Britain, creating a rare pause after years of almost continuous warfare. For a short period, Europe was at peace. In France, Napoleon's popularity grew. A referendum approved making him first consul for life. The title gave him even greater authority and made it increasingly obvious that the republic created during the Revolution was moving toward a new form of personal rule. Napoleon also began creating a new elite around himself. The Legion of Honor rewarded military and civilian service. Titles, ceremonies, uniforms, and increasingly elaborate displays surrounded the government. The young revolutionary general was changing. His residences became more magnificent. Artists painted heroic portraits of him. Officials treated him with growing ceremony. Members of his family received important positions. And Napoleon began thinking about succession. If his government depended entirely upon one man, what would happen when that man died? Supporters argued that hereditary rule could provide the stability France had lacked since the Revolution. There were also genuine threats against Napoleon's life. Royalist conspirators hoped to restore the Bourbon monarchy, and assassination plots reinforced the argument that France needed a permanent political settlement. Napoleon increasingly believed that the answer was a crown. In 1804, the French Senate proclaimed him Emperor of the French. The Republic still existed in name, and Napoleon insisted that his authority came from the French people rather than from ancient royal tradition. But the symbolism was unmistakable. On December 2nd, 1804, an elaborate coronation ceremony took place inside Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Pope Pius VII attended. Generals, officials, diplomats, members of Napoleon's family, and representatives from across France filled the cathedral. Napoleon wore magnificent robes. Josephine stood beside him. At the crucial moment, Napoleon took the imperial crown and placed it upon his own head. The exact meaning of the gesture has been debated, and the ceremony had been carefully planned in advance, but the image was powerful. Napoleon Bonaparte had crowned himself emperor. The Corsican boy who had once arrived at military school speaking French with a heavy accent now ruled France. But across the English Channel, Britain was once again at war with him. Austria and Russia were preparing to join a new coalition, and enormous armies were gathering across Europe. Napoleon had reached the throne. Now he would have to defend it. By 1805, Napoleon Bonaparte had reached a position that would have seemed almost unimaginable only a decade earlier. He was Emperor of the French, commander of one of the strongest armies in Europe, and ruler of a country whose influence stretched far beyond its borders. Yet his new empire was surrounded by enemies. Britain remained Napoleon's most persistent opponent. The two countries had briefly been at peace following the Treaty of Amiens, but the peace did not last. War resumed in 1803, and Napoleon began making preparations for an invasion of Britain. Along the northern coast of France, an enormous army gathered near Boulogne. Tens of thousands of soldiers trained in camps overlooking the English Channel. Boats were constructed, supplies accumulated, and detailed plans prepared. Napoleon believed that if his forces could cross the narrow stretch of water and land in England, the British army might be defeated before it could organize an effective defense. But one enormous obstacle stood in his way: the Royal Navy. Napoleon could dominate battlefields on land, but Britain controlled the seas. Without temporary control of the Channel, transporting an entire army across the water would be extremely dangerous. Napoleon therefore developed complicated plans intended to draw British warships away, long enough for the French fleet to concentrate and protect the invasion. Those plans never succeeded. Meanwhile, Britain was building another European coalition against France. Austria and Russia joined the struggle, creating what became known as the Third Coalition. Their armies prepared to move against Napoleon from the east. Napoleon immediately changed his plans. The invasion camps at Boulogne were abandoned, and the army that had spent months preparing to cross the Channel turned towards Central Europe instead. This force became known as the Grande Armée. It was one of the most formidable military organizations Europe had yet seen. Napoleon divided his army into corps, each containing infantry, cavalry, artillery, and supporting units. A corps could operate independently for a period of time, allowing different parts of the army to march along separate roads and then rapidly concentrate when a major battle approached. This gave Napoleon extraordinary flexibility. Rather than moving as one enormous slow column, his army could spread across the countryside, move quickly, and confuse enemy commanders about where the main attack would come. In late August 1805, the Grande Armée began marching east. The speed of the movement was remarkable. Soldiers who had expected to invade Britain suddenly found themselves covering hundreds of miles toward Germany. They marched day after day, carrying muskets, ammunition, packs, cooking equipment, and whatever food they could obtain along the route. Napoleon's first major target was an Austrian army near the German city of Ulm. Rather than simply attacking it from the front, French corps moved around the Austrian position, cutting roads and threatening lines of retreat. The Austrians gradually realized that Napoleon had maneuvered behind them. By October, much of the Austrian army at Ulm was surrounded. Thousands surrendered. Napoleon had effectively destroyed a major enemy force with relatively limited large-scale fighting. The road toward Vienna was open. But while Napoleon was winning on land, terrible news arrived from the sea. On October 21st, 1805, British and Franco-Spanish fleets met near Cape Trafalgar off the coast of Spain. Admiral Horatio Nelson led the British fleet into battle. The fighting was fierce. Nelson was mortally wounded, but the British achieved an overwhelming victory. Much of the combined French and Spanish fleet was captured or destroyed. The Battle of Trafalgar confirmed British naval dominance and effectively ended Napoleon's realistic hopes of invading Britain. The Emperor could dominate much of the European continent, but the sea belonged to Britain. Napoleon continued toward Vienna. French forces entered the Austrian capital in November, but the war was not finished. A large Russian army had joined surviving Austrian forces farther north. Napoleon now faced the combined armies of two major European powers. The decisive confrontation came near the town of Austerlitz on December 2nd, 1805. It was exactly 1 year after Napoleon's coronation as emperor. The battlefield was cold and misty in the early morning. Napoleon deliberately allowed his right flank to appear weaker than it truly was, hoping the Allied commanders would concentrate their forces there. If they did, they would weaken the center of their line. The Allies took the bait. Large numbers of Russian and Austrian troops moved south to attack the French right. As they descended from the high ground known as the Pratzen Heights, Napoleon watched the movement develop. Then he ordered his center forward. French troops emerged through the morning mist and began climbing toward the heights. The Allied center, weakened by the movement of troops toward Napoleon's right, struggled to stop them. Fighting spread across the battlefield. By afternoon, the Allied army was divided and retreating. Austerlitz became one of Napoleon's greatest victories. The battle later became known as the Battle of the Three Emperors because Napoleon, Russian Emperor Alexander I, and Austrian Emperor Francis II were all present with their armies. For Napoleon, the victory seemed to confirm everything he believed about his military system. Careful preparation, deception, speed, and the concentration of force at the decisive moment had defeated an army larger than his own. The political consequences were enormous. Austria requested peace. Under the Treaty of Pressburg, it surrendered territory and influence. The following year, the centuries-old Holy Roman Empire came to an end after Emperor Francis gave up the imperial title associated with it. Napoleon reorganized much of Germany into the Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of states aligned with France. The map of Europe was changing, but another powerful country was becoming increasingly alarmed. Prussia had remained outside the Third Coalition, but Napoleon's growing influence in Germany threatened its own position. Relations deteriorated rapidly, and in 1806, Prussia declared war. Napoleon responded with his usual speed. The Prussian army carried an enormous reputation. The victories of Frederick the Great during the previous century were still remembered throughout Europe, and many Prussian officers believed their disciplined forces could defeat the French. But the Prussian military system had changed little, while warfare around it had evolved. In October 1806, Napoleon's forces confronted the Prussians in the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt. The result was devastating. At Jena, Napoleon defeated the forces in front of him. At Auerstedt, Marshal Louis-Nicolas Davout, commanding a much smaller French force, defeated the main Prussian army. Prussian resistance collapsed with astonishing speed. French soldiers entered Berlin later that month. Within weeks, one of Europe's great military powers had been shattered. Napoleon was now at the height of his influence, but Russia remained in the war. The campaign continued east into Poland during the winter of 1806 and 1807. Conditions deteriorated badly. Roads became seas of mud. Temperatures fell. Supplies struggled to reach the troops, and soldiers who had marched victoriously through Germany found themselves exhausted in unfamiliar territory. In February 1807, Napoleon fought the Russians at Eylau. Unlike Austerlitz, Eylau produced no elegant victory. The battle took place in freezing conditions amid snowstorms that sometimes made it difficult for soldiers to see what was happening around them. Thousands were killed or wounded in brutal fighting. Neither side achieved a clear, decisive result. Napoleon remained on the battlefield, but the cost had been enormous. The campaign continued. 4 months later, in June, Napoleon met the Russian army again near Friedland. This time, he achieved the decisive victory he had been seeking. Russian forces were driven back toward the Niemen River and suffered heavy losses. Emperor Alexander I agreed to negotiate. The meeting between Napoleon and Alexander became one of the most theatrical diplomatic moments of the era. A raft was constructed in the middle of the Niemen River near the town of Tilsit. A decorated pavilion stood upon it. Napoleon approached from one bank while Alexander arrived from the other. The two emperors met in the middle of the river. They spoke privately and appeared to develop a mutual fascination. The resulting treaties of Tilsit in July 1807 reorganized much of Europe. Russia agreed to cooperate with Napoleon, while Prussia lost significant territory. For the moment, Napoleon had no major continental enemy actively fighting him. From Spain to Poland, from northern Germany to Italy, his influence stretched across Europe. Some territories were incorporated directly into the French Empire. Others were governed by allies or members of Napoleon's own family. His brothers and relatives received crowns and titles. Joseph Bonaparte became King of Naples before later being moved to Spain. Louis Bonaparte became King of Holland. Jérôme Bonaparte became King of Westphalia. Napoleon was building not simply a French empire, but a family dynasty. Yet one enemy remained beyond his reach: Britain. Unable to defeat Britain at sea, Napoleon attempted to defeat it economically. He created what became known as the Continental System, intended to prevent European countries from trading with Britain. Ports under French influence were ordered to close themselves to British goods. In theory, the system would damage Britain's economy and force it toward peace. In practice, enforcing it across thousands of miles of coastline proved extremely difficult. Smuggling became widespread. European merchants resented the restrictions, and some countries depended heavily on British trade. The attempt to enforce the continental system would gradually pull Napoleon into new conflicts. One of them would begin on the Iberian Peninsula. In 1807, French troops entered Portugal, which had resisted Napoleon's demands to restrict trade with Britain. To reach Portugal, French forces crossed Spain. Napoleon soon became involved in Spanish politics as well. He believed the region could be reorganized, just as he had reorganized parts of Germany and Italy. But Spain would not respond as he expected. Resistance began spreading. Villages, towns, soldiers, civilians, and irregular fighters took up arms against French occupation. British forces soon arrived to support them. Napoleon had spent years defeating the great professional armies of Europe in carefully planned battles. Now he was entering a different kind of war. It would become known as the Peninsular War. And slowly, almost unnoticed at first, the empire Napoleon had built so rapidly was beginning to develop cracks. In 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte appeared to stand near the height of his power. Austria had been defeated, Prussia had been humbled, and Russia had temporarily become an ally. Across Europe, rulers and governments had learned to fear the arrival of the French emperor and his Grande Armée. Yet on the Iberian Peninsula, Napoleon was about to discover that defeating an army was very different from controlling an entire country. The trouble had begun with Portugal. Napoleon's continental system was intended to weaken Britain by preventing European countries from trading with it. Portugal, however, maintained close economic ties with Britain and resisted Napoleon's demands. In 1807, French troops marched through Spain toward Portugal. The Portuguese royal family fled across the Atlantic to Brazil shortly before French forces entered Lisbon. Napoleon had successfully occupied Portugal, but his attention soon turned towards Spain itself. Spain was officially allied with France, but its monarchy was deeply divided. King Charles IV and his son Ferdinand were locked in a political struggle, and Napoleon saw an opportunity to intervene. He summoned members of the Spanish royal family to the French town of Bayonne and pressured them into giving up their claims to the throne. Napoleon then placed his older brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. From Napoleon's perspective, the decision made sense. He had already installed members of his family in positions of power elsewhere in Europe, and he expected Spain to accept the new political arrangement. Instead, the country erupted. On May 2nd, 1808, an uprising broke out in Madrid. Crowds attacked French soldiers, and fierce fighting spread through the streets. French forces regained control and responded with executions, but the violence only deepened Spanish anger. News of the uprising traveled across the country. Resistance appeared in cities, villages, and rural areas. Local councils organized opposition, former soldiers joined the fighting, and ordinary civilians took up weapons. Some formed small irregular bands that attacked French patrols, messengers, and supply columns before disappearing into the countryside. The Spanish word for this kind of small-scale warfare was guerrilla. It would soon become familiar throughout Europe. Napoleon's armies had been designed to move rapidly and defeat concentrated enemy forces. Guerrilla warfare presented a very different problem. A French army might capture a city or defeat a Spanish force in battle, yet the roads behind it could remain dangerous. Supplies had to travel through hostile territory, and thousands of soldiers were needed simply to protect communications. The situation became even worse for Napoleon in July 1808. Near the town of Bailén in southern Spain, a French army under General Pierre Dupont was surrounded by Spanish forces. After several days of fighting and negotiations, Dupont surrendered. Thousands of French soldiers became prisoners. The defeat shocked Europe. Napoleon's armies were not invincible. Joseph Bonaparte abandoned Madrid, and French forces withdrew toward northern Spain. Napoleon realized that he would have to intervene personally. In late 1808, he crossed into Spain with a large army. The difference was immediate. Napoleon moved with the speed that had characterized his earlier campaigns. Spanish armies were defeated or pushed aside, and French forces advanced rapidly toward Madrid. In December, Napoleon entered the Spanish capital and restored his brother's government. For a moment, it appeared that he had solved the problem. But British troops were now operating in the peninsula. A British army under Sir John Moore advanced into Spain, threatening Napoleon's communications. Napoleon turned north and attempted to trap it. The British retreated through difficult winter conditions toward the port of Corunna, where ships waited to evacuate them. Napoleon did not remain to finish the pursuit. News had reached him that Austria was preparing for another war. He left Spain in January 1809 and returned to France. Napoleon would never personally return to the peninsula. The war, however, continued. British forces returned under a commander who would become one of Napoleon's most important enemies, Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. Wellesley understood that defeating France in Spain required patience. Rather than seeking one dramatic battle that would decide the entire war, he carefully protected his army, used strong defensive positions, and relied upon Britain's ability to supply forces by sea. Portuguese troops were reorganized and trained alongside the British. Spanish armies continued fighting, while guerrillas made French control of the countryside increasingly difficult. For French soldiers, service in Spain could be exhausting. A regiment might march into a village and find it apparently peaceful, only to face an attack later along an isolated road. Messages disappeared. Supply wagons were captured. Small groups of soldiers could vanish without explanation. French commanders responded with harsh reprisals, which often created even greater resentment among the population. The war became increasingly brutal. Napoleon later referred to the conflict as the Spanish ulcer, an image that captured the way the peninsula slowly consumed French soldiers, money, and attention. Yet while the war continued in Spain, Napoleon faced a more immediate threat in Central Europe. In April 1809, Austria declared war on France once again. The Austrians hoped that Napoleon's difficulties in Spain had created an opportunity. Their armies moved into Bavaria, while Napoleon rushed east to take command. Once again, he responded with remarkable speed. Within days, French and Allied forces defeated Austrian units in a series of engagements and drove them backward. Napoleon advanced along the Danube and entered Vienna for the second time in his career. But the Austrian army had not been destroyed. It waited across the Danube. Napoleon attempted to cross the river near the villages of Aspen and Essling in May 1809. His forces moved across temporary bridges onto an island and then toward the opposite bank. The Austrians attacked. For 2 days, enormous numbers of soldiers fought around the villages. Austrian artillery and troops repeatedly threatened the French bridges across the Danube, disrupting Napoleon's ability to move reinforcements and supplies. Eventually, Napoleon ordered a withdrawal. The Battle of Aspen-Essling became his first major personal defeat on a European battlefield. One of his closest commanders, Marshal Jean Lannes, was mortally wounded. Napoleon visited him as he lay dying, deeply affected by the loss. But Napoleon was not finished. For several weeks, he prepared another crossing. More troops were gathered, bridges strengthened, and plans carefully developed. In early July, Napoleon crossed the Danube again. The armies met near the village of Wagram. The battle was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of men participated over 2 days. Artillery batteries fired across the open landscape, while infantry columns moved through smoke and dust. This time, Napoleon prevailed. Austria requested peace. The resulting Treaty of Schönbrunn forced Austria to surrender additional territory and once again confirmed French dominance in Central Europe. Napoleon had survived another coalition, But he now faced a more personal problem. He had been married to Josephine for more than a decade, and despite their complicated relationship, the two had developed a deep attachment. Yet they had produced no child together. For Napoleon, this had become a political issue. He had created an empire and intended to establish a dynasty. Without an heir, there was no clear guarantee that his system would survive after his death. In late 1809, Napoleon and Josephine agreed to divorce. The separation was emotional. Josephine continued to live comfortably and retained the title of Empress, but her days as Napoleon's wife were over. Napoleon began searching for a new bride among Europe's royal families. His choice was Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria, the daughter of Emperor Francis I. The marriage was politically remarkable. Napoleon, born into minor Corsican nobility, was now marrying into the ancient Habsburg dynasty, one of the oldest ruling families in Europe. They married in 1810. The following year, Marie-Louise gave birth to a son. Napoleon was delighted. The child was given the title King of Rome, and Napoleon finally had the heir he had wanted. To observers across Europe, his dynasty now appeared secure. By 1811, the French Empire reached its greatest territorial extent. France itself had expanded far beyond its earlier borders. Napoleon controlled or influenced much of Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, Poland, and other regions. His relatives and allies sat on European thrones. From a distance, the empire appeared almost unstoppable. But maintaining such an enormous system required constant pressure. The continental system remained difficult to enforce. European economies suffered from restrictions on British trade, and resentment toward French control continued to grow. Most importantly, Napoleon's relationship with Russia was deteriorating. Emperor Alexander I had become increasingly unwilling to follow Napoleon's economic policies. Russian merchants depended upon international trade, and the continental system damaged Russian interests. There were also disagreements over Poland and Napoleon's growing influence across Europe. The friendship created on the raft at Tilsit was disappearing. Napoleon began assembling an army. It would be larger than any force he had ever commanded. Frenchmen marched alongside Poles, Germans, Italians, Dutchmen, Swiss, Croats, and soldiers from across Napoleon's empire and allied states. Hundreds of thousands of men gathered in Eastern Europe. Their destination was Russia. Napoleon expected another rapid campaign. He hoped to defeat the Russian army in a decisive battle, force Alexander to negotiate, and return before winter. But Russia was vast. Its roads were poor. Its armies could retreat almost endlessly into the interior. And in the summer of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte began the campaign that would change everything. In the summer of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the head of the largest army he had ever assembled. Soldiers had gathered from across the French Empire and its allied states, forming an enormous multinational force commonly known as the Grande Armée. Napoleon had defeated Austria, Prussia, and Russia before. He believed another carefully planned campaign could bring Emperor Alexander I back into cooperation with France. But Russia would be unlike any campaign Napoleon had fought before. Relations between the two emperors had been deteriorating for years. Alexander had become increasingly frustrated with the continental system, which restricted trade with Britain and placed considerable pressure on the Russian economy. Napoleon, meanwhile, was angered by Russia's unwillingness to enforce the system fully. Disagreements over Poland and the balance of power in Eastern Europe made the relationship even worse. By 1812, both sides were preparing for war. Napoleon assembled an extraordinary force of several 100,000 men. Despite its French identity, much of the Grande Armée was not actually French. Poles, Germans, Italians, Dutchmen, Swiss, and soldiers from other parts of Europe marched alongside French troops. Supplying such an enormous force presented a problem before the campaign even began. Every soldier required food. Horses required enormous quantities of fodder. Muskets needed ammunition. Artillery pieces needed shells, and thousands of wagons were required to carry equipment. Napoleon's armies traditionally moved quickly and obtained part of their food from the territory through which they marched. In Western and Central Europe, where roads were relatively developed and towns were close together, this system had often worked. Russia was different. On June 24, 1812, Napoleon's army began crossing the Niemen River into the Russian Empire. Napoleon expected the Russian armies to stand and fight somewhere near the frontier. His preferred strategy was familiar: find the enemy, concentrate superior force against it, win a decisive battle, and force the opposing government to negotiate. The Russians refused to cooperate. Instead of risking destruction near the border, Russian commanders withdrew deeper into their own territory. Napoleon followed. Day after day, the Grande Armée marched eastward. Summer heat became oppressive. Dust covered the roads and filled soldiers' clothing. Water could be difficult to find, and supplies struggled to keep pace. Horses began dying in large numbers from exhaustion, poor feeding, and disease. Men fell sick. Some deserted. Others simply collapsed beside the road. The army was shrinking before Napoleon had even fought the decisive battle he wanted. Russian forces continued withdrawing, sometimes destroying supplies that might be useful to the French. Villages could be abandoned, food removed, and fields stripped as the armies moved east. Napoleon advanced farther. In August, the French reached Smolensk. Here, Russian forces finally offered significant resistance. Fighting broke out around the old fortified city, and French artillery bombarded defensive positions. Fires spread through parts of Smolensk as the battle continued. Napoleon hoped the Russians would remain and fight a decisive engagement. Once again, they withdrew. The French entered a damaged and partially burning city. Napoleon now faced a difficult choice. He had already marched hundreds of miles into Russia. His army had suffered enormous losses through disease, exhaustion, desertion, and smaller engagements. The sensible option might have been to stop, reorganize, and prepare for another campaign. But Moscow lay farther east. Napoleon believed capturing the ancient Russian city could force Alexander to negotiate. So the march continued. By September, Russian public pressure for a major battle had become intense. General Mikhail Kutuzov, recently appointed to command the Russian army, chose a defensive position near the village of Borodino, roughly 70 miles west of Moscow. There, on September the 7th, the two armies met. The Battle of Borodino became one of the bloodiest single days of the Napoleonic Wars. Before sunrise, soldiers prepared themselves in the darkness. Muskets were loaded. Artillery crews arranged ammunition. Officers moved among their units. Then the guns began. Napoleon ordered attacks against heavily defended Russian positions. French infantry advanced through smoke and artillery fire, capturing positions only to face counterattacks. The fighting continued for hours. Thousands of artillery rounds crossed the battlefield. Cavalry charged through gaps between formations. Infantry units suffered devastating losses while advancing over ground already covered with dead and wounded soldiers. Napoleon remained behind the front, receiving reports and deciding where to send reinforcements. He had one powerful reserve available, the Imperial Guard. These were some of his most experienced and trusted soldiers. Several commanders urged him to commit them. Napoleon refused. He was deep inside Russia, hundreds of miles from friendly territory, and he was unwilling to risk his final reserve. By evening, the Russian army began withdrawing. Technically, Napoleon held the battlefield, but it was not the victory he needed. The Russian army had been badly damaged, yet it had not been destroyed. French losses were also severe. Tens of thousands of men from both armies had been killed or wounded. The road to Moscow was open. A week later, Napoleon approached the city. On September 14th, French soldiers entered Moscow expecting to find a great capital filled with inhabitants, officials, supplies, and perhaps representatives from Alexander asking for peace. Instead, they found something strange. Much of the city was nearly empty. Large numbers of residents had left. Then fires began. Flames appeared in different parts of Moscow and spread rapidly through neighborhoods filled with wooden buildings. Strong winds carried sparks across streets and rooftops. The exact origins of all the fires remain debated, though Russian actions contributed substantially to the destruction. For several days, Moscow burned. Napoleon watched from the Kremlin before temporarily leaving when the flames became too dangerous. When the fires finally subsided, large sections of the city had been destroyed. Still, Napoleon waited. He expected Alexander to negotiate. Days passed. No offer came. Napoleon sent messages. Alexander refused to make peace. September turned into October. The Russian autumn was approaching, and Napoleon's strategic position was becoming increasingly dangerous. His army was hundreds of miles inside enemy territory. Supplies were limited, and the surrounding countryside had already been heavily stripped. Finally, on October 19th, Napoleon ordered the retreat from Moscow. He initially hoped to move along a different route through territory that had not already been devastated. Russian forces blocked the way, forcing much of the French army back toward the same road it had used during the advance. That road offered little food. The retreat became a nightmare. Temperatures dropped. Snow began falling. The popular image of Napoleon's defeat often focuses entirely on the Russian winter, but the Grande Armée had already suffered enormous losses before the worst cold arrived. Disease, hunger, desertion, battle casualties, and the collapse of the supply system had weakened it for months. The cold made everything worse. Soldiers wrapped themselves in whatever clothing they could find. Some abandoned weapons and equipment to make walking easier. Horses died beside the road, and starving men sometimes cut meat from the carcasses. At night, soldiers crowded around fires. Those who wandered away from the column risked capture by Russian cavalry or irregular fighters. Discipline gradually broke down. Units that had once marched in organized formations became scattered groups of exhausted men simply trying to survive. Napoleon continued westward with the remains of his army. One of the most dangerous moments came in late November at the Berezina River. Russian armies were closing in, and the bridges normally used to cross the river had been destroyed. For a time, the Grande Armée appeared trapped. French engineers entered the freezing water and constructed temporary bridges while enemy forces approached. Many of the engineers worked for hours in icy conditions, and a large number later died from exposure. Soldiers, wagons, civilians, horses and artillery crowded toward the crossings. Chaos followed. Despite enormous losses, much of Napoleon's remaining combat force managed to escape across the river. The retreat continued. In early December, Napoleon received disturbing news from Paris. An attempted coup had taken place while he was away, revealing how vulnerable his government could become if people believed he was dead. Napoleon decided to leave the army and race back to France. Traveling rapidly by carriage and sleigh, he crossed Europe while the remains of the Grande Armée continued westward. When the survivors finally crossed back over the Niemen, the force that returned looked nothing like the magnificent army that had entered Russia months earlier. The scale of the disaster was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers who had crossed into Russia were dead, wounded, missing, captured, or scattered. Exact numbers remain debated because the army's strength changed throughout the campaign and reinforcements arrived at different times, but only a fraction of the original invasion force returned in organized condition. Napoleon himself survived. His empire survived, but the illusion of invincibility did not. Across Europe, Napoleon's enemies watched carefully. Prussia had been humiliated by him in 1806. Austria had been defeated repeatedly. Russia had watched French soldiers enter Moscow. Now the Grande Armée had been shattered. For the first time in years, the European powers saw an opportunity not simply to resist Napoleon, but perhaps to destroy his empire altogether. Prussia prepared to rise against him. Russia pushed west. Britain continued fighting in Spain. Austria began reconsidering its alliance. Napoleon returned to Paris and immediately began building another army. France still possessed enormous resources, and his ability to organize new forces remained remarkable. Young recruits were called into service, weapons were gathered, and new regiments appeared with extraordinary speed. Within months, Napoleon would once again take the field. But these soldiers were not the veterans of Austerlitz, Jena, and Friedland. Many were young and inexperienced, and this time Napoleon would face enemies who had learned from years of defeat. The campaign in Russia had ended. The struggle for Napoleon's empire was about to begin. When Napoleon returned to Paris in December 1812, he faced the greatest crisis of his career. The invasion of Russia had destroyed much of the Grande Armée, and across Europe, countries that had spent years living under French dominance began to sense an opportunity. Napoleon immediately started rebuilding. France still possessed enormous resources, and new soldiers were called into service. Within months, Napoleon had assembled another large army. Many of these recruits, however, were young and inexperienced. The veterans who had once formed the heart of the Grande Armée could not easily be replaced, and France was also desperately short of experienced cavalry and horses. Meanwhile, Napoleon's enemies were gathering. Prussia joined Russia against France in early 1813, and Britain continued fighting French forces in Spain. Austria initially remained cautious, but eventually joined the coalition as well. Sweden and several German states also turned against Napoleon. Once again, much of Europe was at war with him. Napoleon traveled east and took command of his new army. Despite the disaster in Russia, his abilities on the battlefield had not disappeared. In the spring of 1813, he defeated coalition forces at Lutzen and Bautzen, but neither victory was decisive enough to end the war. The enemy armies had learned from years of fighting Napoleon. Rather than always confronting him directly, coalition commanders increasingly tried to avoid Napoleon himself while attacking armies commanded by his marshals. Their strategy was simple: weaken the French Empire without giving Napoleon the decisive battle he wanted. By the autumn of 1813, enormous armies were gathering around the German city of Leipzig. The battle began on October 16th. Napoleon commanded roughly 190,000 troops, while coalition forces eventually brought considerably more men onto the battlefield. Russians, Prussians, Austrians, Swedes, and soldiers from other states converged around the French positions. For several days, the countryside around Leipzig shook with artillery fire. The fighting became known as the Battle of the Nations because of the extraordinary number of countries represented. It was one of the largest battles Europe had ever witnessed. Napoleon fought desperately to hold his position, but the coalition's numerical advantage continued to grow. Eventually, he ordered a retreat. As French forces attempted to cross the river behind Leipzig, disaster struck. A bridge was destroyed too early, trapping thousands of French soldiers on the wrong side. Some attempted to swim across the water, while others were captured. Napoleon escaped, but the defeat was devastating. His control over Germany began collapsing almost immediately. States that had once been allied with France changed sides. French troops withdrew westward, and the political system Napoleon had constructed across Central Europe began falling apart. The following year, the war reached France itself. For Napoleon, this was a very different experience. For years, his campaigns had taken place in Italy, Austria, Germany, Poland, Spain, and Russia. Now enemy soldiers were marching across French soil. Napoleon refused to surrender. During the early months of 1814, he conducted one of the most impressive campaigns of his career. With a relatively small army, he moved rapidly between larger coalition forces, defeating them at battles such as Champaubert, Montmirail, and Montereau. For brief moments, the old Napoleon seemed to have returned, but there were simply too many enemy soldiers. Every victory cost men he could not replace. Coalition armies continued moving toward Paris, while Napoleon struggled to defend multiple directions at once. On March 31st, 1814, coalition forces entered the French capital. Napoleon was away with his army when he received the news. He wanted to continue fighting, but many of his senior commanders had reached their limit. France had been at war for years. Hundreds of thousands had died, the countryside had been invaded, and Napoleon's marshals increasingly believed further resistance was hopeless. They urged him to abdicate. At first, Napoleon attempted to preserve the throne for his young son. The coalition powers refused. Finally, on April 6, 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte abdicated. The man who had once controlled much of Europe was no longer emperor of the French. The victorious powers allowed him to retain the title of emperor, but only over a tiny Mediterranean island called Elba. Before leaving, Napoleon said farewell to soldiers of the Imperial Guard at the Palace of Fontainebleau. Many of these men had followed him through years of campaigning across Europe. Napoleon embraced their commander and kissed the Guard's eagle standard. Then he departed. In May 1814, he arrived on Elba. The island was small, mountainous, and peaceful compared with the enormous empire he had once ruled. Napoleon was given a residence, a small military force, and authority over the island's inhabitants. He began reorganizing roads, mines, agriculture, and local administration almost immediately. Even on a tiny island, Napoleon could not stop governing. Back in France, the Bourbon monarchy was restored under King Louis XVIII. To Europe's rulers, the Napoleonic era appeared to be over. But Napoleon continued receiving reports from France. He heard about dissatisfaction with the restored monarchy. He knew that many soldiers still remembered him with loyalty. He also became concerned that his enemies might eventually move him somewhere much farther away. Napoleon had spent less than a year on Elba when he made his decision. On the evening of February 26, 1815, he quietly boarded a ship with several hundred soldiers. The small fleet sailed away from the island. Napoleon was going back to France, and Europe was about to discover that its most troublesome emperor was not finished yet. On March 1, 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte stepped ashore on the southern coast of France with only a small force behind him. Less than a year had passed since his abdication, and the Bourbon monarchy had been restored under King Louis XVIII. Napoleon was taking an extraordinary gamble. He had no enormous army waiting for him, no major city under his control, and no guarantee that the French people would welcome his return. If government troops captured him, his attempt could end almost immediately. Instead of marching directly toward heavily defended areas, Napoleon moved north through the mountains, following a route that would later become known as the Route Napoleon. News of his arrival spread quickly. The government ordered troops to stop him. Near Grenoble, Napoleon encountered a royalist regiment blocking the road. According to the famous account of the confrontation, Napoleon walked toward the soldiers and challenged them to fire upon their emperor if they wished. They did not fire. Instead, many joined him. As Napoleon continued toward Paris, the same pattern repeated itself. Soldiers who had been sent to arrest him changed sides. Officers who remembered serving under him returned to his cause. Crowds gathered along the roads to watch the former emperor pass. With every mile, Napoleon's small force grew larger. Marshal Michel Ney, one of Napoleon's most famous commanders, initially promised King Louis XVIII that he would stop Napoleon. But Ney had spent years fighting alongside the emperor, and when he encountered the growing movement supporting his former commander, he changed sides as well. The restored monarchy began to collapse. Louis XVIII realized that Paris could not be held without risking serious conflict and fled the capital. On March 20th, Napoleon entered Paris. Only 3 weeks had passed since he landed in France. He returned to the Tuileries Palace and once again assumed control of the country. The extraordinary period that followed became known as the 100 Days. Napoleon understood that France had changed during his absence. He attempted to present himself as a more moderate ruler and promised constitutional reforms. After years of war, he also claimed that he wanted peace. Europe's other great powers did not believe him. Representatives of Austria, Britain, Prussia, and Russia had been meeting at the Congress of Vienna when news arrived that Napoleon had escaped from Elba. They responded quickly. Napoleon was declared an outlaw, and the powers that had defeated him began preparing armies once again. Napoleon knew he could not wait. Hundreds of thousands of coalition soldiers would eventually surround France. His best chance was to attack before all of those armies could gather. The nearest major enemy forces were in what is now Belgium. A British-led army commanded by the Duke of Wellington was positioned around Brussels. Nearby stood a Prussian army commanded by Field Marshal Gebhard von Blücher. Napoleon's plan was familiar. He would move rapidly between the two armies, Keep them separated, defeat one, and then turn against the other. In June 1815, Napoleon left Paris to join his army. He was 45 years old. The energetic young commander of the Italian campaign was now a man who had spent nearly 2 decades living through almost continuous political and military struggle. His health was not always as strong as it had once been, but his confidence in his ability to command an army remained. On June 15th, French forces crossed into Belgium. Napoleon had achieved surprise. The following day, he attacked the Prussians at Ligny. After hours of fighting, the Prussian army withdrew. It would become Napoleon's final battlefield victory. But the Prussians had not been destroyed. At the same time, French forces fought Wellington's troops at Quatre Bras. The Allies held their position long enough to prevent Napoleon from achieving the complete separation of the two enemy armies that he wanted. Wellington eventually withdrew toward a defensive position south of Brussels. The Prussians retreated in another direction, but they remained close enough to support him. Napoleon believed he still had time. He sent Marshal Emmanuel de Grouchy with a large force to follow the Prussians while he turned toward Wellington. On the evening of June 17th, heavy rain began falling across the Belgian countryside. French soldiers marched through mud while thunderstorms rolled over the landscape. Ahead of them, Wellington's army stopped along a ridge near a small village. The village was called Waterloo. Wellington positioned his troops and waited. Napoleon's army arrived and camped nearby. Across the wet fields, tens of thousands of soldiers prepared for the following morning. Some had fought Napoleon for years. Others were young men experiencing their first campaign. Many would not survive the next day. On June 18, 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte prepared to command an army in battle for the final time. The morning of June 18, 1815, began beneath a grey sky. Heavy rain from the previous night had soaked the fields around Waterloo, turning parts of the battlefield into thick mud. Across the countryside stood two armies, preparing for what would become one of the most famous battles in European history. Napoleon commanded roughly 72,000 men. Across from him, the Duke of Wellington commanded a slightly smaller Allied army made up of British, Dutch, Belgian, German, and other troops. Somewhere to the east, the Prussian army was also moving. Napoleon needed to defeat Wellington before the Prussians arrived. Wellington had positioned his army along a ridge, with many of his soldiers protected behind the slope from French artillery. Several fortified farms stood in front of the Allied line, including Hougoumont on Wellington's right and La Haye-Sainte near the centre. Napoleon began the battle with an attack against Hougoumont. What may initially have been intended as a diversion became a battle within the battle. French troops repeatedly attacked the fortified buildings and surrounding woods, while Allied soldiers defended them for hours. Around midday, Napoleon ordered a major infantry attack against Wellington's centre-left. Thousands of French soldiers advanced across the muddy fields. Allied infantry met them near the ridge, and British heavy cavalry charged into the French formations. The attack was pushed back, although the cavalry suffered heavily when it continued too far and encountered French counterattacks. The battle settled into a brutal rhythm. Cannons fired across the fields. Infantry formations exchanged musket volleys. Wounded men and horses covered the ground between the two armies. Then Marshal Michel Ney believed he saw signs that Wellington's army was retreating. He ordered a massive cavalry attack. Thousands of French horsemen moved toward the Allied ridge. But Wellington's infantry had not fled. They formed defensive squares, with soldiers standing several ranks deep and bayonets pointing outward. Horses were extremely reluctant to charge directly into these walls of men and steel. French cavalry circled the squares, searching for openings while artillery and musket fire filled the battlefield. Again and again, cavalry attacks failed to break Wellington's line, and time was running out. On Napoleon's right, troops began appearing in the distance. They were Prussians. Napoleon had hoped Marshal Grouchy would prevent them from reaching the battlefield, but substantial Prussian forces had marched toward Wellington instead. French troops were now forced to fight in two directions. Still, Napoleon had one final force available: the Imperial Guard. These were some of the most experienced soldiers in his army. Many had followed Napoleon through earlier campaigns, and their reputation alone carried enormous psychological weight. As evening approached, Napoleon committed part of the guard against Wellington's line. The soldiers marched uphill through smoke and gunfire. For a brief moment, the outcome remained uncertain. Then Allied troops rose from behind the ridge and opened fire at close range. The guard continued forward, but could not break the line. Eventually, they began falling back. Across the battlefield, a shocking message spread among the French soldiers. The guard was retreating. Panic followed. Wellington ordered a general advance while Prussian forces increased their pressure from the east. The French army began to collapse. Soldiers abandoned positions and crowded onto roads leading south. Units became mixed together as men attempted to escape the battlefield. Napoleon left with the retreating army. Waterloo was over. The defeat had destroyed his final realistic chance of remaining emperor. Napoleon returned to Paris, hoping perhaps that another army could be raised, or that political leaders might allow him to continue the struggle. They would not. France faced overwhelming enemy forces, and support for another prolonged war was disappearing. On June 22, 1815, 4 days after Waterloo, Napoleon abdicated for the second time. He attempted to transfer the throne to his young son, Napoleon II, but the arrangement had little practical effect. Napoleon considered escaping to the United States. He traveled toward the French Atlantic coast, hoping to find passage across the ocean, but British warships were watching the ports, making escape extremely difficult. Eventually, Napoleon decided to surrender himself to the British. He boarded HMS Bellerophon in July 1815. Napoleon apparently hoped he might be permitted to live quietly in Britain, or perhaps somewhere else, in comfortable retirement. The British government had other plans. They had watched Napoleon escape from Elba once already. They would not allow it to happen again. A new place of exile was selected, far from France and far from the Mediterranean. It was a small volcanic island in the South Atlantic Ocean, surrounded by thousands of miles of open water. Its name was Saint Helena. Napoleon had once ruled an empire stretching across Europe. Now his final world would be an isolated island from which escape was almost impossible. In October 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte arrived at Saint Helena. The island was unlike almost anywhere he had lived before. Rising from the remote waters of the South Atlantic, St. Helena was more than 1,000 miles from the nearest major landmass. Steep cliffs surrounded much of its coastline, and British ships watched the surrounding waters. For Napoleon, there would be no second escape. He eventually settled at Longwood House, a residence on an exposed and often damp part of the island. It was a dramatic change for a man who had once occupied magnificent palaces in Paris, commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and determined the fate of kingdoms. Now his world had become very small. Napoleon was accompanied by a handful of loyal followers who had chosen to share his exile. His days gradually developed a routine. He read books, walked or rode around the areas where he was permitted to travel, played cards, discussed politics, and spent long hours remembering the past. Those memories became increasingly important. Napoleon dictated accounts of his campaigns and government to the people around him. He spoke about Italy, Egypt, Austerlitz, Russia, and Waterloo. He defended his decisions, criticized his enemies, and carefully shaped the story of his own life. Even in exile, Napoleon understood the power of reputation. His relationship with the British governor of St. Helena, Sir Hudson Lowe, was deeply hostile. Napoleon complained about restrictions placed upon him and disliked being treated as a prisoner rather than as an emperor. Lowe, meanwhile, had been ordered to make certain that Napoleon never escaped. Years passed. Europe moved on without him. The Bourbon monarchy returned to France. Borders were redrawn, and the great powers attempted to create a more stable European order after decades of revolution and war. Napoleon remained at Longwood. As time passed, his health deteriorated. He became less active and spent increasing amounts of time indoors. He suffered from abdominal pain, weakness, and other symptoms that gradually became more severe. By the spring of 1821, it was clear that he was dying. On May 5th, with rain and wind passing across St. Helena, Napoleon Bonaparte died at the age of 51. An autopsy concluded that stomach cancer was the likely cause of death. Napoleon's father had also died from a stomach illness, suggesting there may have been a family predisposition. Later, theories suggested poisoning, but stomach cancer remains the generally accepted explanation. Napoleon was buried on Saint Helena in a quiet valley beneath willow trees. There was no enormous army, no cheering crowd, no imperial ceremony in Paris. The man who had once dominated Europe was laid to rest on a distant island in the South Atlantic. But Napoleon's story did not end there. In France, memories of the emperor gradually became part of a growing legend. Veterans remembered their campaigns under him. Paintings and books celebrated his victories. Stories of the young artillery officer who had risen to become emperor spread to new generations. In 1840, nearly 20 years after his death, the French government received permission to bring Napoleon's remains home. A French ship sailed to Saint Helena, and his coffin was carried back across the ocean. When Napoleon returned to Paris, enormous crowds gathered along the route. His remains were eventually placed beneath the Great Dome of Les Invalides, where his tomb can still be found today. Napoleon's legacy remains complicated. He had helped preserve several changes created by the French Revolution, reorganized government institutions, encouraged advancement based on ability, and supported the legal reforms that produced the Napoleonic Code. His influence can still be found in legal and administrative systems around the world. But his ambitions also brought years of warfare. Millions of soldiers and civilians across Europe were affected by the conflicts of the Napoleonic era. Cities were occupied, governments overthrown, families separated, and enormous armies marched from Spain to Russia and back again. Napoleon could inspire remarkable loyalty, but his hunger for power repeatedly pushed France into new conflicts. Perhaps that contradiction is part of the reason his life remains so fascinating. He was a boy from Corsica who arrived in France as an outsider. He became an artillery officer, a revolutionary general, first consul, and finally, Emperor of the French. He defeated some of the greatest armies in Europe. He marched into Vienna, Berlin, Madrid, and Moscow. He crowned himself Emperor in Notre Dame. And then, almost as dramatically as he had risen, everything disappeared. His armies were defeated. His empire collapsed. His throne was taken from him. And his final years were spent looking across the quiet landscape of a distant Atlantic island, remembering a world he had once commanded. More than 2 centuries after his death, the name Napoleon Bonaparte remains instantly recognizable. His empire did not survive, but his story did. And that brings us to the end of the remarkable life of Napoleon Bonaparte.